February 24, 2022. Russia launched a full-scale invasion of Ukraine with what was considered the world's third most powerful air force. Nearly 1,000 fighter aircraft, strategic bombers, seemingly high-tech weaponry. On paper, Russia should have achieved air superiority within days. Instead, months into the conflict, Russian aircraft struggled to control Ukrainian airspace. The expected dominance never materialized. This is the story of why one of the world's largest air forces failed to perform as expected against a significantly smaller opponent. Before the invasion, analysts assumed Russian air power would overwhelm Ukrainian defenses. Russia possessed approximately 900 tactical aircraft compared to Ukraine's roughly 100 operational planes. Conventional wisdom suggested Ukraine's air force would be destroyed on the ground in the opening hours, similar to Iraq in 2003. That didn't happen. Ukrainian aircraft continued flying from dispersed airfields. Air defenses remained operational. Russian planes did not establish the dominance the United States achieved in Iraq, Serbia, or Libya. The reasons are both doctrinal and technological. Russia's Air Force was never configured the way Western air forces operate. The Russian Air Force's primary mission has always been air-to-air combat, not ground attack. Soviet military doctrine, which Russia largely inherited, viewed air power as defensive. The Air Force existed to protect Russian territory and ground forces from enemy aircraft, especially over areas where Russia controlled layered radar networks and surface-to-air missile systems. Ground support for Russian forces has historically been provided by artillery, not aircraft. When the Soviet Union designed its military structure, they invested heavily in artillery systems and rockets for fire support. Air power was meant to keep enemy planes away, while artillery did the work of supporting ground troops. This stands in stark contrast to how the United States employs air power. American military doctrine emphasizes air superiority, followed by massive close air support for ground forces. The U.S. invests heavily in systems that allow aircraft to find, identify, and destroy ground targets in near real time. Training, equipment, and tactics all focus on this mission. Russia spent the last 15 years procuring multi-role aircraft, theoretically capable of precision ground strikes. Planes like the Su-34 and upgraded Su-25 SM-3 variants were supposed to provide modern ground attack capabilities, but acquiring the aircraft was only part of the equation. The ancillary systems, targeting pods, reconnaissance platforms, data links, training programs, never fully materialized. Russia bought planes capable of precision strikes but lacked the ecosystem to employ them effectively. When Russian forces crossed the border, they expected Ukrainian air defenses to collapse quickly. Instead, Ukraine's air defense network proved remarkably resilient. Ukrainian forces operated S-300 long-range surface-to-air missiles, shorter-range systems, and thousands of man-portable air defense systems. They used these intelligently. Ukrainian S-300 batteries didn't stay in fixed locations, broadcasting their radar signatures for Russian anti-radiation missiles to target. They moved frequently, used radars sparingly, and relied on external sources for targeting information. NATO AWACS aircraft operating over Poland and Romania could detect Russian aircraft taking off from bases and warn Ukrainian forces. This outside radar information allowed Ukrainian SAM operators to remain radar silent until Russian aircraft were close, then briefly activate, fire, and relocate. Finding and destroying these mobile SAM systems required specialized aircraft and tactics. The United States developed an entire mission set called SEAD, Suppression of Enemy Air Defenses. American aircraft carry equipment to detect radar emissions, locate the source precisely, and immediately attack with anti-radiation missiles. Dedicated electronic warfare aircraft jam enemy radars. Fighter bombers carry targeting pods to visually identify and destroy SAM systems from standoff range. Russia lacks most of these capabilities. They don't have tactical platforms dedicated to geolocating and attacking enemy radars deep in hostile territory. Russian electronic warfare systems exist but aren't integrated into air operations the way American systems are. Without effective SEAD capabilities, Russian aircraft faced a dangerous environment every time they flew over Ukrainian-controlled territory. The alternative to suppressing air defenses is flying low, using terrain to mask aircraft from radar detection. But low-altitude flight dramatically reduces combat radius, essentially halving how far a plane can travel with a useful weapons load. It also exposes aircraft to short-range air defenses and man-portable missiles. Ukraine possessed thousands of these shoulder-launched weapons. Flying low over Ukrainian territory was extremely dangerous. The result was Russian aircraft largely stayed near the front lines or launched standoff weapons from inside Russian airspace. Deep penetration strikes into Ukrainian territory were rare. The risk-to-gain ratio didn't favor aggressive air operations. Even if Russian aircraft could operate safely deep in Ukrainian territory, they faced another critical problem: finding targets. Modern air warfare requires knowing where enemy forces are located. That sounds simple, but is extraordinarily complex in practice. Consider trying to locate Ukrainian artillery. A Ukrainian artillery battery might fire from one location, then move within minutes to avoid counter-battery fire. To strike that battery from the air requires detecting it, determining its location precisely, communicating that information to air assets, getting aircraft to the area, finding the specific target, and engaging before it moves. This is called the kill chain, and speed is everything. During the 1991 Gulf War, the U.S. kill chain reaction time could take up to a full day. By 2003, that had dropped to hours. One famous example involved an attempted strike on Saddam Hussein, where bombs hit just an hour after initial intelligence came in. Today, U.S. Air Force officials claim they can regularly strike time-sensitive targets within an hour. Russia's kill chain appears closer to 1991 U.S. capabilities. Multiple factors contribute to this. First, Russia lacks sufficient reconnaissance assets. They operate a relatively small number of reconnaissance satellites compared to the United States. When Russia repeatedly struck the Zatoka bridge connecting Ukraine with Romania, approximately 1 week passed between each strike attempt. Analysts speculated Russia simply lacked the satellite coverage to quickly assess battle damage and determine if another strike was needed. Russian reconnaissance aircraft are also dated. The Su-24MR reconnaissance plane operates with technology not far beyond Cold War capabilities. Russia planned to replace these with modern reconnaissance pods for the Su-34, but development ran a decade behind schedule. Production only began in 2021, meaning very few existed when the war started. U.S. cruise missiles transmit video feeds before impact, providing immediate battle damage assessment. Russian cruise missiles don't have this capability. Without real-time imagery or sufficient reconnaissance platforms, Russia struggled to quickly determine if strikes succeeded or if targets had moved. The drone fleet presented similar issues. Russia operates several thousand drones, but the vast majority are small, short-range systems lacking the endurance and sensors for deep reconnaissance. The larger Orion drones show promise, but exist in very small numbers. Russia's four-post drones, initially bought from Israel, then license-produced locally, use largely 1990s technology. An improved domestic variant entered low-rate production only in 2020. Compare this to U.S. operations in recent conflicts, where networks of satellites, high-altitude reconnaissance aircraft, and numerous advanced drones provide persistent surveillance. American commanders have near real-time awareness of the battlefield. Russian forces lack this comprehensive picture, especially deep behind Ukrainian lines. Another unexpected problem emerged early in the war: navigation accuracy. Russian Su-34 pilots were photographed using commercial GPS devices taped to their instrument panels, despite Russia operating a full constellation of GLONASS navigation satellites. Russian military equipment is designed to use GLONASS signals, yet pilots resorted to civilian GPS. This suggests Russian satellite navigation signals may be sporadic or less accurate than intended. It potentially explains why more Russian cruise missiles missed their targets than expected. U.S. intelligence assessed that only 40% of Russian missiles hit their intended targets. This figure includes expensive cruise missiles and precision-guided Iskander ballistic missiles, not just unguided munitions. Using commercial navigation also means that data isn't integrated into military systems. Location information can't automatically feed into targeting computers or be shared across data networks. The inefficiency compounds throughout operations. When Russian aircraft did operate over the battlefield, they faced significant limitations in finding and engaging targets. The workhorse ground attack aircraft were the Su-25 and Su-34. These represented Russia's best available platforms for tactical strikes, but both had serious shortcomings compared to Western equivalents. Most Su-25 variants, including the base model and SM variants, lack proper optical targeting devices. Pilots must fly low and use their eyes to find targets. This is extraordinarily dangerous in an environment saturated with manned portable air defense missiles. It also means very few targets will be found. The SM-3 variant includes a half-decent optical tracker with thermal imaging for night operations, but these exist in very limited numbers. The Su-34 and older Su-24 bombers feature built-in optical targeting systems, but the technology is outdated. These systems lack thermal channels, making them unsuitable for night operations. Even daytime operations in cloudy weather might require flying low beneath the cloud deck to visually acquire targets. The optical systems also offer limited viewing angles and fairly poor range, making autonomous target search difficult. Modern Western strike aircraft carry advanced targeting pods with high-resolution thermal imaging, laser designators, and sophisticated processing. These pods allow pilots to detect, identify, and engage targets from high altitude and long range. Some Russian aircraft were observed with targeting pods in recent years, but procurement numbers appear very small. Most Russian strike aircraft lack this critical capability. Without proper targeting systems, Russian planes are largely relegated to attacking fixed, pre-planned targets like buildings, bridges, or known military installations. Finding and engaging relocatable targets, artillery, air defense systems, armored vehicles, is extremely difficult. Guided weapons exist in Russian inventory, but without timely targeting information, even guided munitions are of limited use. Using unguided bombs, even with computer-assisted aiming, remains imprecise. Targets can be found and designated by other means. Army units certainly report enemy positions, but this limits operations to areas near friendly ground forces where such information is available. Pilot training quality also likely affected operations. During the first half of the 2010s, Russian military aviation saw improvements in training hours and readiness. But after 2014, budget constraints caused flight hours to decline. By comparison, U.S. Air Force pilots flew approximately 170 hours in 2019, supplemented by extensive simulator training. Russian pilots were getting significantly less flight time. Insufficient training means pilots will have harder times performing complex missions, especially in high-threat environments. It also increases the risk of accidents and mishaps. Friend or foe identification presented another challenge. Operating over fluid battlefields with both Russian and Ukrainian forces using similar Soviet-era equipment creates confusion. Without robust communication and identification systems, there's risk of Russian air defenses engaging their own aircraft or Russian planes, striking Russian ground units. This may have caused Russia to hold back in situations where target identification was unclear. At the war's start, Russian sortie rates were surprisingly low. This suggested Russian planners didn't anticipate needing significant air power. They expected a quick operation, not an extended, conventional war. Simultaneously, Russia kept substantial air forces defending its western borders against potential NATO intervention. They couldn't commit their entire air force to Ukraine. As the war progressed, sortie rates increased. U.S. intelligence tracked Russian aircraft flying approximately 200 sorties per day initially, later reaching 300 per day. These figures include all sorties: combat, reconnaissance, transport, and escort missions. The actual number of strike sorties was likely between 130 and 200 per day. For context, U.S. coalition combat sortie rates during the 2003 Iraq invasion were somewhat higher, and those were conducted over a smaller area with more concentrated targets. Russia was operating over a much larger area with more dispersed enemy forces. Despite concerns about heavy losses, Russian aircraft attrition wasn't catastrophic. By late May 2022, U.S. intelligence estimated Russia had lost approximately 36 fighter and bomber aircraft, plus over 50 helicopters. These are significant losses, but not crippling for a force Russia's size. However, at Russian production rates, replacing those losses would take roughly 2 years. Russia didn't rely solely on manned aircraft. They fired numerous cruise missiles and ballistic missiles throughout the conflict. U.S. intelligence tracked approximately 1,400 Russian missiles fired by early April, reaching over 2,200 by mid-May. By comparison, the U.S. used a slightly higher number of missiles during the first 5.5 weeks of the 2003 Iraq invasion. But quantity doesn't equal effectiveness. U.S. intelligence assessed only 40% of Russian missiles hit their intended targets. This failure rate is remarkable for expensive precision weapons. It includes Caliber cruise missiles, air-launched missiles, and Iskander ballistic missiles costing millions of dollars each. Russia likely possesses around 1,000 Iskander missiles and perhaps several thousand various cruise missiles. Expending 1,000 expensive precision weapons is no small matter for Russia's economy and military-industrial complex. These weapons would otherwise be held in reserve for potential conflict with NATO. Russia was likely quite cautious about depleting stockpiles that might take years to replenish given sanctions and production constraints. Russia's restrained air operations may also reflect strategic calculation. They couldn't be certain the war wouldn't escalate into wider conflict with NATO. Committing too many aircraft or expending too many precision weapons in Ukraine might leave Russia vulnerable if NATO intervened. This risk-averse approach meant Russian air power never operated at full capacity. Deep strikes into western Ukraine were rare, while Russia could reach targets throughout Ukraine. Repeatedly flying strike packages hundreds of kilometers over hostile territory is dangerous without air supremacy. Unless targets were of critical strategic value, the risk might not justify potential losses. Unlike U.S. operations in Iraq, where much of the western desert offered few places to hide air defenses, Ukraine's terrain provided numerous opportunities for SAM systems to operate from concealed positions. These air power limitations explain why Russian forces relied so heavily on artillery. When targets near the front lines needed engagement, Russian artillery demonstrated it could complete the kill chain much faster than air assets. Artillery required no flight planning, faced no air defense threats, and could respond to targeting information within minutes. This reverted to traditional Russian/Soviet military doctrine. Artillery has always been the preferred means of fire support for Russian ground forces. The Air Force's underperformance simply reinforced reliance on established methods. Russia's Air Force struggles in Ukraine highlight several realities about modern air warfare. First, achieving air superiority against a determined opponent with modern air defenses is extraordinarily difficult without specialized capabilities and training. The SAD mission set the U.S. spent decades developing isn't simple to replicate. Second, precision strike capabilities require more than just smart weapons. They require persistent reconnaissance, fast data networks, advanced targeting systems, well-trained crews, and doctrine built around rapid kill chains. Russia invested in some pieces but never assembled the complete system. Third, air forces designed for one mission can't easily adapt to another. Russia's Air Force was built for air-to-air combat and defense of Russian territory. Shifting to offensive ground attack operations requiring deep penetration of hostile airspace was a fundamental change their force structure couldn't support. Fourth, modern air warfare is as much about information as firepower. Without knowing where targets are, even powerful air forces struggle to apply their capabilities effectively. Russia's reconnaissance gap proved as limiting as any technological shortfall. Russia entered Ukraine with numerical superiority in aircraft and seemingly sophisticated weapons. They failed to achieve expected dominance because their air force was never designed for the mission required. Doctrinal focus on air defense rather than offensive strike, insufficient precision targeting capabilities, limited reconnaissance assets, training deficiencies, and concerns about NATO escalation all contributed to underwhelming performance. This doesn't mean Russian pilots lacked skill or courage. They operated under significant constraints imposed by their equipment, training, and doctrine. The missions required were simply not what their air force was built to accomplish. For military planners worldwide, Ukraine demonstrated that raw numbers of aircraft matter less than integrated capabilities for finding, targeting, and engaging enemy forces, while surviving sophisticated air defenses. It showed that years of peace dividends can erode capabilities that take decades to rebuild. And it proved that assumptions about air power based on one nation's capabilities don't necessarily apply to others, regardless of how modern their equipment appears on paper. The Russian Air Force's struggles in Ukraine will be studied for years as an example of how doctrinal, technological, and structural factors can prevent a numerically superior force from achieving expected results. It's a reminder that, in modern warfare, capability is about far more than counting aircraft and weapons. It's about systems, training, doctrine, and the ability to integrate all elements into effective operations.